I'm joined now by Dr. Rachael Cobb, who's an associate professor in the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University. She is an expert on things like voting patterns, political participation in general, demographics, all of that. Dr. Cobb, thank you so much for being here.
Super happy to be here. Thank you, Joan. Hello.
I want to talk to you. I know that you have already been looking at the data from this last election and breaking it down. And I want to talk to you about each and every one of these categories if we have time. Let's start with white voter support for Trump.
Yes. So overall, let's just say it plainly, whites supported Trump. And it was 62% of white voters earning less than $50,000 voted for Trump. So one of the things we look at is kind of how does it break down if we're looking at one racial category, how does it break down by income? Mm-hmm. Certainly, so overall, 57% of white voters and 5% of black voters supported Trump. But when we break it down a little bit more, we see movement within these areas. What's interesting is that, so overall, Trump won the working class, which, is defined in a lot of different ways, depending on who you're speaking to. But if we're just looking at people without a college degree, by all races, he won that group by 12 points. On the other hand, union voters voted for Harris more than they voted for Biden. So some of the gains for labor were actually reflected in the voting patterns that happened in the 2024 election.
I'm really interested that you're reporting that, because from what little I have read about it, I was concerned that a lot of rank and file union went for Trump. And I don't know specific numbers, but I'm glad to hear that Joe Biden's support of unions and creation of union jobs, it seems to have had an impact, would you say?
It had an impact on that particular population, which we know is, overall a smaller population than the electorate at large. But it is an informed population, and one of the key roles, as we know, that unions play is providing information to their members. And this is one of the key things about groups in American politics and why they're so important, because if you identify with that group and that group is providing key information to you, you hear it from them in a way that you don't necessarily, or you hear it differently from other organizations that are coming at you.
I want to talk to you about a group that seems to have emerged as an important factor in this last election, and that is Latino men. When you looked at demographically at the vote, did you break out men, or did you just look at the Latino community as a whole?
Well, the Latino community as a whole, but I'll tell you, this is one of those things that is that scholars are working on how we define Latinos and how Latinos define themselves, whether they identify as Latinos themselves or whether they identify as Americans. We do know that conservative Latinos and those favoring anti-immigration views showed the most significant shift towards Trump. And Catholic Latinos preferred him for his anti-abortion stance. And essentially, low-income, less educated Latinos increased their support for Trump, although class seemed to be less influential in its ways. But this is one of those groups that, people are seeing moving over time with more support going toward the Republican Party. They had 30 to 35% in the 2020 election, and now up to 43% voting Republican in the 2024 election. So that was a movement. And what people are starting to say is that essentially both parties now have each of them actually has a multi-ethnic coalition. The Republicans have a multi-ethnic coalition. The Democrats have a multi-ethnic coalition. But the Democratic multi-ethnic coalition is a little bit more, multi-ethnic. But they're on the left, sort of more united by racial progress, and on the right, united essentially in opposition to that vision. So it's a fascinating set of things that are happening along as racial and ethnic lines in this country. But it's sort of it's like the Americanization of groups who now are sort of joining the party coalitions, and identities are fluid, as we know, and some fade and some rise.
Really interesting. And I know that it has been widely speculated that, Latinos may be, as a group, more Catholic than other groups, and that might have played a role, as you mentioned, with the abortion issue. But there was also, I read, and I don't have any idea if this is quantifiable in any way, Donald Trump really in this last election, or at least his younger supporters, sort of created this whole idea that somehow he was a macho man. There was this what's been described by Anthony Scaramucci, who knew him well, as this hyper masculinity that he projects. Is there any way that data can tell us if that sort of attitude played a role in the election?
Well, absolutely, data can tell us that. And, I have to say, on a slightly irrelevant but interesting thing today, it sort of crossed my desk that there's a new working paper about boys around the world, but boys apparently in Norway are more ideologically polarized than ever, and even in Norway, there's an anti-feminist kind of view and a growing masculinity, so this may not be even unique to the United States. But certainly what we are seeing in survey evidence and from other kinds of work being done to look at public opinion is that views on masculinity are, especially among men, as you said, hardening in some ways, and the view of what it means to be a man, Trump is defining now for a generation of young men.
I've been reading more and more about this. Somebody, a friend of mine, shared with me a few weeks ago an article where they were analyzing college admission and admission to certain majors. And the conclusion for that article was, the more women are attracted to a profession, the fewer men apply. They cited applications to veterinarian school and how over the last couple of decades, there's been this shift from mostly men, a few women, and then it was like more women and a little, and now it's to the point where applications to veterinarian school, the majority are from women. The article was also analyzing college admissions and who applies to college. And, it seems like as college becomes more of an opportunity for women and something they care about, it becomes less popular with men. What the heck is that? What on God's earth is that? Please explain it to me.
Well, I wish this were my area of study. I cannot explain why that happens, but certainly I am aware of these observations, and they happen across the board in the professions. I was also thinking of pediatricians, for example. I mean, there's the other piece of this is that the wages in those professions, as the women gain more traction, the wages tend to go down. So there's that piece too. But I think, at the at the college level, it is the kind of this is where I am not the expert on this. I do not know exactly what is happening, but we do know that girls are essentially are doing well in grade school, and some of the things that they bring to the table are valued by the education system, and there clearly is a struggle right now with how to raise and educate our young men. Colleges are interested in attracting these young men because they, of course, are interested in enrollment. And so this is a challenge for our society writ large, that it is really important to have everybody going into professions, and that we should not be, segregating essentially by gender in any area, really. But why this is happening, how to address it, we have got to get another team of people here to discuss.
We need to take a break, and I promise when we come back, Dr. Cobb, I will be back on topic. I'm talking to Dr. Rachael Cobb, who's an expert on political participation. We're going to get back on that subject right after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Every weekday afternoon from 2 to 5 p.m. on WCPT 820.
With me is Dr. Rachael Cobb, who's assistant professor of political science and legal studies at Suffolk University, who specializes in voting patterns and demographics, political participation. One of the things I wanted to be, before we move off of how various demographic groups voted, I want to talk about youth voting, because, I have studied the demographics of the elections I've covered over the years. And one thing that almost always surprises me is the low turnout among younger voters. There have been the rare exceptions, but the rule seems to be not so much. What did you find out about this last election?
Well, it went down. The youth vote went down. People were so excited because we saw these gains, essentially from Obama on forward, of youth voting more and more and more, and 50%, over 50% in 2020. But it went down in 2024 by about 8%. And, part of the big picture about why young people don't vote is, first of all, like with any of these things, it's complicated. But it is the barriers to voting that exist are especially hard on young people because they are more mobile. They are new to the process. I work with these young people every day. They are nervous about voting, even when they grew up in households where they routinely went to vote with their parents and had essentially all of the advantages. The idea of voting for them is still, it's a new thing. And anytime we do a new thing, we may be excited, but we're also a little nervous about how people are going to respond to us, what they're going to think, all of those things. But we do know, what the barriers in general to participation. The first major one is registering to vote. That first of all, in many states, there's a deadline that you have to register by. That's a barrier unto itself. Filling out that form. There are a lot of states that have websites where you can do an online voter registration form. But if you don't have a driver's license, then you usually have to print out that form, and sometimes you have to fold it and put it in an envelope and send it. And I say this lovingly. I was with a young person this past fall who, when I said, and now just put it in an envelope and put a stamp on it, and that person said to me, "What's a stamp?"
Oh, no. Oh, God, no.
Yeah. So that's what we're dealing with. And of course this person didn't know what a stamp was, never had to use one. And we don't see post offices everywhere. We're not seeing, so this is a whole new world, and that into itself, so that even that you have to print it out and mail it, that's a barrier.
Wow.
And then the next piece is, well, you have to find your polling location. But one of the things I talk about with my students is, how do you even know that the word polling location, what is that? That's a vocabulary word that is not part of our normal, parlance on a everyday basis. And for sure, people confuse the word poll, take a poll in a survey so we know what the polls say, versus a telephone poll versus a polling location. And that we sort of expect people to know this stuff osmotically, but they don't. And our high schools are not necessarily teaching civics. And even when they are teaching civics, sometimes they do these wonderful civics projects and students learn about lots of great things, but these kind of basic stuff, they're not necessarily learning. So there's a lot of things that are sort of the hidden curriculum of voting that is very challenging for young people. And then, of course, the voter ID requirements. Do they have a driver's license? Does the state require an ID? I mean, I could go on and on and on, and I am happy to. But these are all challenges, and that my main point is that it's magnified for young people. So getting them over that hurdle is even more work than getting somebody who is an occasional voter.
I noticed on the stats that you reported when you were writing about barriers to voting that 48% reported little to no information about voting. Is that what you're talking about? Not about the candidates, but about just the actual process?
Exactly. That is precisely what I'm talking about, that they feel disconnected because all of this is like a world that they are not part of and they're not invited into. In fact, one of the things that always frustrates me, I have the benefit of bringing wonderful people in to talk with my students who are politicians themselves, and they're great. But, sometimes the students say, hey, you don't care about my issues. And the retort is, well, guess what? You don't vote. That is it's like the students making them feel bad for something rather than saying, hey, part of the political process is that we talk about the issues that our voters care about. We need you to vote, and let me show you how. So this kind of reframing of it, blame and shame, rather than I know that you're sincerely confused about this and I want to help you. Wow. And I feel so much of what we do to our young people is make them feel bad about what they don't know. And, I can understand them feeling alienated and disconnected. I'm like, well, if you don't care about me, why should I care?
I will admit, several years ago, maybe putting my children in a position where they were going to embarrass themselves. I actually have a rotary phone, and I got it out and I put it in front of them and I said, how do you think you use this? And they looked at it and they looked at it and they could see numbers and they could see these little holes. And they looked at it and they were like, I don't know. How would you make a call with this? And I was like, give me your finger. And I said, you want a 7? You put it in the 7 hole. And then you turn it. And then you let it go. And I, of course, found this absolutely hilarious. I simply reinforced the thought amongst both my adult children that I'm an absolute dinosaur, that I actually lived at a time when these things were useful. But, I know that people like me who were reporting on this election, we really thought, even if old fogies like me still, vote more conservatively, I really thought the young people are going to save us. This is the election. They've lost their rights, their medical autonomy. There's so many other things they grew up with that now appear in danger. This is the election. The young people will turn out in vast numbers, and they will make the difference. Why did that not happen?
Well, I think it comes back to that they were as concerned as sort of the average voter writ large about what James Carville would say, like, it's the economy, stupid. And so it was economic messages and their very economic insecurity that propelled them, along with everyone else, to vote their pocketbooks. And then, of course, what they were hearing about what was causing it, whether that is true or not is the other discussion. But they were concerned about jobs and inflation and all of those other things. Not all of them are going to college, of course, so it's a different group that was benefiting from Biden's discussion about loan forgiveness. But they are facing this insecure world, and Trump was certainly presenting an economic story, tying all kinds of things together, inflation to immigration to crime, and essentially exploiting those economic stories to the advantage. And we had an election in which we had an unpopular president in a party that's an incumbent, and also a president who was very old, and these two very old people going at it. Even so, Harris made huge gains when she came in and really shifted the playing field, but it was not a good playing field to start. And so but she didn't make it to the finish line. And I don't know. I mean, would it have been different had Biden dropped out sooner? I know from my own kids who, they grew up with a very political mother. So it is not that we're not talking about it. The difference that they experienced, they were just so not excited about the election prior to July at all.
Wow.
Not engaged. Not engaged. And I was the old folks saying, like, you got to think about this.
One of the big topics has been a historical shift in who supports which party. Democrats have been decrying the fact that even though they try to enact laws and policies that will benefit working people, it seems that those working people would rather vote Republican. What do you see from the data about any historical shifts in party support?
I actually, on this one, I think it is, if you were forgetting everything and just saying, hey, at a time when there's rising inflation and an unpopular incumbent, is that person likely to win? The answer is no. So I sort of think in many ways it's not really a shift. It's highly predictable.
Huh.
Now, the thing that is different is this is a very different kind of set of promises and set of rights, and all of the things that shaped this election were so big and bigger than just the economy. But at the end of the day, I think the outcome in that sense was what it was. So there are some people who are saying actually Democrats don't really shift your strategy too much, because you might pivot too far in another direction that really you would have been fine had you not had the inflation and the unpopular incumbent.
And even though Joe Biden didn't engender any kind of excitement, Kamala Harris was viewed as a much more charismatic, shall we say, candidate. Yep. Do you think you sort of touched on this a little bit about the idea of would she have done better if she'd had more time? But if you looked into this kind of data, I suspect that if she had been a white man, we would have a Democratic president, as opposed to not only, God forbid, a woman, but a woman of color. Whew! I just don't think we're there yet.
And I know a lot of people who see it that way, too. And I have to say, I mean, this is like just my gut and what I think. This is not grounded in running all kinds of scenarios to see what would have happened. My thinking is, first of all, she did move the needle. She moved the needle a lot. There was a white man who wasn't popular, and then she kind of electrified things, and a lot of people moved to her. Would it have been different had a white man, would a younger white man been able to move the needle even farther? Maybe. But the other piece of it is, would that have alienated women more so than they might have been otherwise? So it's a toughie to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right.
I think, yeah. So one positive spin here is she did a lot. Again, she didn't make it to.
She did an awful lot in a very short amount of time. Speaking of time, we are up against news at the top of the hour. Thank you, Dr. Rachael Cobb, Associate Professor of Political Science and Legal Studies at Suffolk University. Thank you for being here. This has been very interesting.
It was a treat. Thank you very much.